So I grew up watching a lot of 90s Nickelodeon. Rugrats, CatDog, Rocco, these were all pretty much my jam. But if I had to pick one favorite, that honor would go to Hey Arnold. I just found it to be like nothing else. While most of the other cartoons were about silliness and belly laughs, Hey Arnold had a more dry sense of humor. And despite the character designs, it always just felt more real. While I loved my silly shows as much as the next kid, Hey Arnold stood out as being more of a slice of life, centering around real problems told in a way understandable to kids. Problems like alcoholism, a failing marriage, poverty, and most notably, missing parents. See, at the time, cartoon families weren't particularly diverse. If they ever showed a kid's family, you could bet it'd be married parents living in a middle-class house with maybe a sibling or two. But Arnold had no parents, and it wasn't ham-fisted or mentioned all the time. He just didn't. He lived with his eccentric grandparents in a boarding house with not much info about how he got there. And that was awesome. Imagine you're a kid in the 90s missing a parent. Hey Arnold was one of the only cartoons out there that really tried to relate to you about it. I wasn't one of those kids, but it still stood out to me. However, it's not like they never mentioned his parents. Every now and then we'd get hints about who they might have been. This was done by Grandpa Phil telling Arnold stories about their supposed adventures in the jungle. These episodes were rare, but every now and then Arnold would get just as curious as the audience. And even though most of the time he was portrayed as noticeably mature, there'd be rare instances where being an orphan would get to him, like it would anyone. Over the course of the show's 5 seasons, we'd be consistently teased about what happened to them. Eventually we learned that they dropped Arnold off at the boarding house at some point when he was a toddler, and they just never came back. Even his grandparents never found out what happened to them, but Grandpa Phil always tried to make sure Arnold never forgot who they were. Like I said, every now and then he'd tell stories about some crazy adventure they had as a kind of Indiana Jones-like superhero duo. Now personally, I took this as Phil exaggerating to make Arnold feel better, which at one point he sorta confirmed. His grandson is sad, so he tries to build up his parents as these perfect superheroes to make a little boy feel better, and Arnold, who had to grow up faster than his peers, would allow himself to be a little boy again for just a few moments. He let himself believe his parents were these swashbuckling badasses, even if deep down he knew Phil was exaggerating. But he liked it. And maybe when he was ready, he'd hear the more mundane truth. In my head, I always thought they died in a more realistic way, like a car crash. But Phil wasn't ready to tell Arnold just yet. Maybe it was immature on his part, but hey, it's not the easiest thing for Phil to deal with either. Maybe to him, these wild stories were his own way of processing it. Well, boy was I wrong, because the Jungle movie contradicts all the emotional depth and nuance I assumed. Fucking great. So in 2002, Hey Arnold ends with a 2-parter called The Journal. In it, Arnold finds his dad's old diary from when his parents first met. As Phil reads it out loud, we spend the episode seeing the events play out. We see the meet-cute, the wedding, and even Arnold's birth. Arnold is happy to hear his father's words told in such great detail, but he still laments that he doesn't know what happened to them. However, in the very last scene, Arnold finds a map of San Lorenzo, which is where his parents disappeared. And that's where the series ends. See, the plan was for this to lead to a theatrical film that would have Arnold going to San Lorenzo to try to find his parents. This is because Nickelodeon ordered 2 movies based on the show, one that would go to TV and one that would go to theaters. First, they would start production on the TV film called Arnold Saves the Neighborhood, which would air during the series' run. After that, they'd end the show on a cliffhanger that would lead to the theatrical film, The Jungle Movie, which would also serve as a definitive finale. Unfortunately, though, Nickelodeon kinda screwed them. Because of the success of Rugrats movies, combined with a few positive test screenings, Nick decided to put Arnold Saves the Neighborhood in theaters, promising to still do The Jungle Movie as a sequel. Arnold Saves the Neighborhood was then retitled Hey Arnold the Movie, and was redone to look more like a theatrical film. And it didn't do so well. It got pretty bad reviews from critics, who made a point of praising the source material, but didn't feel like the movie did it justice. It did moderately well financially, grossing $15 million against a budget of $4 million, but was far under expectations. Compared to the $140 million brought in from the Rugrats movie, it's understandable why it was considered a disappointment. With that, Nickelodeon pulled the plug on the Jungle Movie.
Fool this man!
Now, this is before we had the online resources we do now, so fans didn't know why the series ended the way it did. Hell, people didn't even know the Jungle Movie was a thing. We just knew there was some weird cliffhanger about Arnold finding a map in one of the episodes that went nowhere. Years later, however, series creator Craig Bartlett started discussing the predicament publicly. As 90s nostalgia grew more prevalent, he started popping up in YouTube interviews talking about the movie that never came to be. And while we still didn't have an answer about Arnold's parents, it was nice to hear that there actually was a plan, as well as why it never happened. Over the years, Bartlett shared more details about the cancelled film, including plot points and even animation samples. However, he noticeably wouldn't give any spoilers because of the off chance the film would still get made. At this point it was around 2009, so it seemed pretty unlikely, but it was nice to see him trying to generate buzz. But somehow, it worked. Hearing about this energized nostalgic fans. People started making online petitions to convince Nickelodeon to greenlight the movie, and I won't lie, I signed one of those fuckers. A couple years later, Hey Arnold started airing reruns on Nixplat, a programming block for older shows. This led to public interest in the show resurging, which in turn led to more people hearing about the Jungle movie. Finally, in 2012, Bartlett revealed that he was, in fact, taking meetings with Nickelodeon about working there again. While he didn't say anything specific about the Jungle movie, in 2015, Nick was the one to announce they were working on a Hey Arnold revival. Then 1 year later, Craig Bartlett himself confirmed that the Jungle movie was coming in 2017. After all this time, the fan buzz worked. The evil suits and ties were finally going to give us what we wanted. And on November 24th, the day finally came. And what did we get? Well, what did we get? Now I need to clarify, I am super grateful this movie got made. Before this, I just kind of bitterly accepted I was never going to find out the ending to my favorite childhood Nicktoon. And now I know. Arnold's parents were, in fact, alive. They just had the sleeping sickness, and had actually been asleep for the entire series. Yep, asleep. Without needing food, a shave, or physical therapy. Just with some gray streaks in their hair to show that it had been a while. Oh, and apparently Arnold is a long-lost prince or something.
What?
So here's what bugs me about this and most of the movie. It goes against everything we loved about Hey Arnold. The slice-of-life show about real problems that people watching could relate to. Yeah, I know it's a cartoon, specifically a children's cartoon, but it's Hey Arnold! This isn't the kind of cartoony silliness you'd expect from Hey Arnold. Which sums up my main problem with the film. It never really wants to capture that low-key, down-to-earth spirit. This is a straight-up action-adventure movie, full of sword fights, outrageous themes, cartoon physics. It's basically the opposite of what made Hey Arnold stand out. There were still moments that made me smile. The first few minutes of the movie were more or less its prime, showing old supporting characters from the show and referencing their respective episodes, and I will say that this line,
Trude, you guys are still alive?
made me chuckle. That is the kind of humor you'd find in Hey Arnold. But the rest of it just felt like it was made for a different cartoon. For a show that stood out with its realism to be this swashbuckling adventure with a pretty ridiculous explanation for his parents, I'm sorry, is kind of a letdown. Now you might say that I'm biased because Hey Arnold is my favorite, and with all the years of build-up, there wasn't going to be any movie that would meet my expectations. And you know what? That's fair. And for that reason, I cut the movie some slack. But I just wish it would have felt more like Hey Arnold, because genre-wise it feels off-brand. It's like if they brought back As Told by Ginger and made it goofy like Ed, Edd n Eddy. Hell, it's like if they brought back Ed, Edd n Eddy and made it a dramedy like As Told by Ginger. It just isn't on brand, and I have a hard time believing this is what they had been planning the whole series. And it got me wondering, who exactly is this movie for? And I know what you might be thinking, it's a kids movie, so don't take it so seriously. But it's the revival of a show that ended 15 years prior. All the people who wanted these answers are grown up now, so why not make it for an older audience? Now I do understand logically why they didn't. Nickelodeon is a kids network after all, and I doubt Craig Bartlett would even be interested in making it R-rated. But with how off-brand this movie is, it almost feels more geared toward the kids of today. But those kids didn't grow up with Hey Arnold. If it doesn't mean as much to them, why bother aiming it there? Maybe that was the only way the network would greenlight it. It's also worth pointing out that there were a few jokes in the original show that probably would no longer make the cut as kids' humor.
And take this health crap with you!
So while there is a precedent for Hey Arnold going a little edgy, I guess the standard for kids' humor changes over the course of 2 decades. Who would have thought? But that brings up the same question I asked before, and I have it for most of these 90s revivals. Who exactly are they made for? You can also see this phenomenon in the newest Pokemon movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. It seems like Japan also couldn't resist capitalizing on 90s nostalgia, so they released a full CGI remake of the original Pokemon film from over 20 years ago. While not a reboot nor a revival, yes, there's a difference, look it up, it has the same problem of having no clear demographic. I say it's not a revival because the Pokemon anime has been running consistently since '97, but the concept still applies. Pokemon also has the same issue a lot of long-running kid shows do, where it doesn't want to age with its audience. The kids who watch Pokemon in the 90s for the most part aren't the same people who watch it today. Granted, there are plenty of adults who keep up with the Pokemon franchise as a whole, myself included, but the anime specifically remains extra child-friendly. Rather than age with its fans, it simply cycles the fans out so new kids can discover it. This is why every few years the show has a new set of supporting characters, so new children can have their own experiences with it. Needless to say, Pokemon is now a completely different show. There was also a big turning point for English-speaking fans when in the mid-2000s, the dub unexpectedly changed its voice cast.
Pikachu, use Thunderbolt! Now use Bullet Seed!
And it wasn't only the cast, the entire American crew changed as well. With this massive shift, more millennial fans started to drop off. Pokemon was at this point at a decline in American popularity, but this change cut off a sizable portion of their remaining fans. Still, Gen Z kids didn't have much reason to care. They can now adopt Pokemon as their show, and with the continuous revamping of the series, it almost doesn't make sense to remake the first movie. Redoing a film that's considered iconic to 90s kids, but making it with the sensibilities of children today, again begs the same question. Who is it for? It can't be for the millennials, it hardly feels like the show they grew up with. The characters all sound different, and the direction and writing style is clearly that of a different show. But it's hardly more for younger kids, because it's a story that doesn't mean as much to them. Plus, they didn't grow up with these characters. Seeing Misty and Brock and Togepi doesn't give them nostalgia, because it wasn't their childhood experience with the series. No, this was the experience of people who were now in their late 20s or early 30s. But then why make the movie so clearly aimed at young children? The tricky thing about kids' entertainment is making it tolerable to all ages, including adults. Kids can watch it, and parents can deal with it. Shows like Ren and Stimpy and Rocko's Modern Life were frequently praised for this. Despite the former gaining more network backlash, shows like these added plenty of adult humor that went over the kids' heads, but kind of winked at parents to help them enjoy the ride. This makes them sort of timeless in a way, because you can go back as an adult and enjoy all the things you missed. So when you're reviving one of these shows, which audience are you going for? Do you want to gear it toward adults to reach its original crowd? Well, of course not. You couldn't do that. It's being picked up by a kids network, not an adult network. So the only option is to make it for children. But kids today have completely different sensibilities than kids 20 years ago. I'm not going to go on a whole ramble about how kids these days just don't get it, or how their cartoons just aren't as great as the gold we got like Angela Anaconda or Mr. Meaty. But sensibility changes with generations, and there's nothing wrong with that. But unless these kids networks are okay with Tommy Pickles dropping F-bombs or CatDog finally showing how they take a dump, most of these revivals are going to fall to the same fate, having no clear demographic. But it's so strange to me that Hey Arnold, a show full of adult in-jokes and millennial dry humor, went in a completely different direction to appeal to a more modern audience. But not all hope is lost, because there are in fact some shows that try to do it right. Example, Rocko's Modern Life Static Cling. Released on Netflix in 2019, this revival pokes fun at itself constantly. The plot has the characters circling the globe because their favorite 90s show gets cancelled. It has a pretty self-aware message about nostalgia, and how part of happy memories is letting them stay in the past. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no. I won't give any spoilers, but it even tackles LGBTQ acceptance, and it does so rather tastefully. At first it might feel jarring to hear these characters talking about this stuff, but let's be real. How old are people who would care about a Rocko special on Netflix? Adults! And the writers know this. And maybe it would take all revivals going direct to streaming for them to be aimed at adults. The Pokemon movie I discussed also debuted on Netflix, but that's a different story. They're more at the mercy of what Japan gives them. and Pokemon has a very tight grip on its public image. But the Jungle movie goes beyond that. While it still does beg the question of exactly who it's aimed for, my gripe is that it's off-brand. While I certainly won't say it ruined the old series, it's hard for me to watch it and mentally picture that the entire time, Arnold's parents were asleep in a giant shrine to him built by indigenous people. I now have to keep that in mind while watching a slice-of-life dramedy. Those things just don't mesh well. In one of the last scenes, we get a fake-out ending. Arnold wakes up, and we're supposed to think for a moment that the movie was just a dream. But of course, his parents are eating breakfast with the rest of the boarding house. While I knew this was a fake-out, I can't deny that part of me hoped it was real. But hey, that probably wouldn't have made me any happier. Maybe I'd be making a whole video about how they should have kept the parents thing real. Maybe no matter what we get, nothing will beat the power of childhood nostalgia. We'll always build up our cartoons as golden gods, and no revival could possibly match up. Maybe we should take a tip from Rocco and enjoy the past where it belongs. In the past. Hey guys, thanks a whole bunch for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and hit that stupid little bell for notifications. Also want to give a shout out to my first patron, Stephen Walk. What a beautiful name for a beautiful specimen. Link is in the description if you'd also like to join my Patreon. For as little as $2, you could help me grow and regularly improve my channel, as well as keep it running regardless of outside circumcisions.